I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're talking about the Holocaust. You might think you know a lot about this awful time in human history. You know that 6 million Jews were murdered by a madman by the name of Adolf Hitler. You know there are untold stories of victims, but there are also stories of survivors, of course. And more than survivors, there are stories of heroes that were born out of this awful chapter. Today, we're taking a look at one of those stories. The name of the book is Not Without a Fight, the story of a Polish Jew's resistance. And I'm joined right now on Spotlight by the author of that book, D.W. Duke. D.W., thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me. Pleased to be here.
Tell me, this is a fascinating story of a young man, 8 years old, living in Poland in opulence, a 30-room mansion, and then his life is turned upside down. Before we get into his story, I'd like you to tell me how you found out about his story in the first place.
Well, I had actually, his son is a cousin of mine, and I was helping him with a legal matter. I'm an attorney. I was helping him with a legal matter. And during the process, we began talking about family, and he told me the story of his father, which I was aware, but I didn't know the details. And the more I listened to it, I thought we probably should write a book about this because it's a pretty eventful occurrence.
And you collaborated with Cass's son to write this book, as a matter of fact, right?
That's correct. And Cass was still alive when we wrote it, so I had plenty of opportunity to interview him and get information from him as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. The timing was perfect. I know you first wrote the book in 2017. We're lucky to have a survivor from that era still with us in that year. Tell us a little bit about the story of Cass Beiberstein.
Okay. Well, Cass was 8 years old when Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. He was living in a 30-room mansion, as we mentioned. And after the invasion, they were forced to stay in a factory during the bombing because it was the only safe place to be. When they finally returned back to their house, they found out that the Nazi soldiers had come in and raided the place, but they weren't there at the time. So they moved back into the house. They were able to stay there for quite some time until actually it was Oskar Schindler. At that time, he was not sympathetic to Jewish people, but he was selling artifacts, Jewish artifacts, to officers, and he wanted to use this house for that purpose. So he essentially ran them out of the house, and then they were bounced around in apartments that the family had owned in Warsaw, and then they eventually wound up in the ghetto. And it was in the ghetto where Cass really began to take up arms to fight back. And again, he was only 8 years old when Germany invaded. So by the age of 10, he was using a rifle against the Nazi soldiers.
Exactly. So he's 8 years old. He's been subjected to hardship that he never dreamed possible growing up in such an affluent lifestyle. Now he's in the ghetto in Warsaw, and he's mad. He's angry. And that is fueling the Jewish resistance. And tell us a little bit about his participation in the Jewish resistance and the Jewish resistance itself. I don't think a lot is often told about the Jewish resistance.
I think that's true. A lot of people are not aware that there was a faction of Jewish resistance fighters. And in 1943, they had an uprising, and they fought. They were very fierce when they fought. But one thing that Cass always told me was, I don't want the world to always think of the Jewish people as going like sheep to the slaughter. That's the phrase he would use. He said, because there were a lot of us who fought back. We were outnumbered. We had no weapons, but we did the best we could. And they managed, they would collect weapons as they would defeat Nazi soldiers. And so he became a sniper for the underground. And they would shoot from the roof at the Germans as they came up the street. And of course, the Germans were surprised because they never expected to get any resistance from the Jewish people, because they tended to view them as so passive and so submissive. But even before the confrontation became escalated in street fighting, Cass was working in a factory where they made rifles. And only Jewish people were working in the factory, with the exception of the supervisors. What they did, they learned that the Nazis would only inspect every 10th rifle. It was like, automatic, every 10th rifle. All the rifles in between were not inspected. So what they would do, they would file down the firing pin And so the German soldier would be out in the field, and he would use the gun a few times, and then suddenly it would break. It wouldn't work. And they did this quite a bit, and the Nazis always thought that there was a problem with the metal. It never occurred to them that the Jews in the factory were doing this. So for Cass, that was the way they were fighting back very early on in the war. He was proud of that activity.
Absolutely. Now, he was very young. I mean, he's a young teenager and he's fighting as a sniper. How old was he when he entered the Jewish resistance?
His first, he actually fought outside of the resistance initially because he was just on his own. He first used his rifle to execute a Nazi when he was 10. And he was a marksman. His grandfather was a major in the Polish army before the invasion. And so he had taught him how to use a rifle. He was extremely skilled using the rifle. And so that's when he first began resisting. Then in 43, at that point is when the resistance began to form and become a more powerful unit. And then he joined them and fought in the streets.
It must have been very inspiring talking to him. I've actually been very close with some Holocaust survivors. I remember a landlord at an apartment house in Queens. His name was Mr. Rotter, and he would proudly show his tattoo with his number on it and talk about what happened back then, because never forget was the motto. And even till this day, it's important to remember the horrors that can happen in this world. Tell me a little bit what it was like conversing with Cass.
Well, when I met Cass, he was in his late 80s, very humble man, but he really, his main thing was he just wanted people to know that the image that we have of the Jewish people in the lines, going to be executed, was not always the case, and that there was a strong resistance and they fought. Very kind man, very well liked. People would come and listen to him talk. Now, he tended not to talk about these activities outside of the family until he was well into his 80s. He was interviewed by the Spielberg Shoah Project, but even there, he didn't disclose everything, because he always had a concern that the Nazis might come, that sympathetic people might come back and do something to his family members. So it wasn't until very late he finally decided it was okay. It's now it's time, safe to come out with his story. So that's how he asked me to write the book.
And it's amazing how close we are to Cass's story. His son is your client, and so it's just one generation away.
Yes.
Pretty amazing. Tell me what you found most profound when writing this book. What part really struck you the most? What part made you tear up or cry? What part would you like the audience and the reader to understand best?
Well, one thing that really struck me was the number of Nazi soldiers who would help them. Even though they were Nazi soldiers, there was one sergeant in particular. He would warn them when something was going to happen and they needed to move somewhere to avoid an invasion or whatever. So there were people within the Nazi military who were sympathetic and would try to help them. The other thing was that there was a Catholic family that they had befriended right before the war, a couple of years before the war. And his father had known that man as a businessman. And that family did extraordinary things to help them. In fact, there was one event that was really, it's a very sad story. The boys were out, this is before they were in the ghetto, they were out in the neighborhood after curfew, and some Nazi soldiers came on them and began to conclude that they might be Jewish. And they used to have a test. They would make them drop their trousers to see if they were circumcised or not. They told the boys to do that, and the boys immediately ran. They knew what was coming. They ran up an alley. There was a Catholic church sitting there, and they knew the priest, and they had met him from the family, the Catholic family. They ran into the side door, and the Catholic priest had a sister who was about 20 years old. And the priest told them to hide under the altar, up in front under the altar. They crawled under the altar, and they could see out a little bit, and they could see what's going on. The Nazis came in, shoved his sister, the priest's sister, to the floor, put a gun to her head, and told the priest that if he did not tell them where the boys were, he was going to execute his sister. The girl in her 20s, they saw her mouth the word no and shake her head no to her brother. And so they shot her and executed her.
Jesus.
That stayed with them for the rest of their lives, and they've never, ever forgotten that. She willingly gave her life to save them.
Amazing, amazing. And it's a chilling, concrete depiction of abject cruelty
Yes.
and absolute disdain for human life. It's
Mhm.
an amazing story. It's chronicled in a book that you just got to read. It is called Not Without a Fight, the story of a Polish Jew's resistance. You will not forget the young life and the later life of Cass Beiberstein after reading this book. And we often say in journalism, if you tell the stories of large numbers, if you tell the story of statistics, it doesn't really have much impact. But if you tell the story of one person and how they were impacted, it gets across to you. And this is that book. It is in the category of a Schindler's List. Absolutely put it on your reading list. The author's name is D.W. Duke, and I'm delighted that he joined us here today on Spotlight. D.W., thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. And to the folks at home who are watching, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.